Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Presentation Hall in the School of Communication and Media in the College of the Arts. I want to extend a special welcome. How many people here are from Justice Studies? Welcome. Tonight, we have a very special event. My name's Neil Baldwin. I'm the director of the Creative Research Center. And tonight's Symposium is the 7th annual event that we've done in the last 7 years, devoted to the imagination. Every year, we go to a different department or different college at the university to talk about the imagination in that discipline. We started out with the imagination in the post-9/11 world. Then we went to CSAM for the scientific imagination. We did the cinematic imagination, the entrepreneurial imagination in the business school, the digital imagination. Last year, we had a program with the Department of Religion on the religious imagination. And this year, I'm especially proud to share the stage with these great faculty members from the Department of Justice Studies. So I'm going to introduce the Master of Ceremonies for tonight, a woman who needs no introduction to you. Norma Connolly and I go way back to when I first came to Montclair State 12 years ago. She's an inspiring colleague with a fine legal and strategic mind and a charismatic personality, and she's a friend. It's my great honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Norma Connolly.
Okay, no selfies. I know it's being taped, so that alone is driving me crazy, but it is a great honor to be here to address you. I'm the scary one that everybody sort of avoids my office when they have to come to ask for special requests. I am particularly touched by Neil's words of introduction, but I am more touched to be able to introduce the faculty that you all know, whereby they are going to speak from their very varied perspectives on justice. And I know all of you, as everyone else in the world, has a perception or a conception of what justice is. I think if you're a justice studies major, it should be something that you preoccupy yourself with, because after all, it is your major, okay? Now, people who are going to be addressing you are going to be telling you what the way that they have approached justice. Because if I sat around this room and called on you, God forbid, and had you stand up and tell me how you would define justice, I'm sure I'm going to get many and varied definitions of the term. Not that everyone is right, not that everyone is wrong, but the definitions vary depending on your background, depending on your circumstances, depending on your race, depending on your gender, depending on your sexual orientation, and more importantly, depending where you come from. Your life experiences matters and impacts on justice. These 4 researchers, who are your faculty members, will be giving you their perspectives from both a national and a transnational. Because in today's day and age, one cannot start to look at or interpret justice without understanding that it is a global concept which impacts on us all. I will make a few introductory remarks in front of each speaker, and then after all, I'm going to ask you, all of you, to hold your questions to the end. And then there will be student assistants that will either bring a mic to you so that you can ask questions. So as everyone is doing their presentation, I'm going to ask each and every one of you to come up with one question that you would find it interesting to ask the speaker about whatever it is that he or she is presenting. Okay? Just one question. This should be easy peasy. Okay? All right. First one up is going to be Jason. Okay. All right. Dr. Jason Williams is one of our newest faculty members. He does a lot of ethnographic studies on race and justice. He has just presented and completed a very successful selected topics course on Black Lives Matter, and he's one of our mainstays in teaching Perspectives on Justice 205. We are particularly honored and blessed to have him with us, and I'm going to turn over the mic to him so that he can give you his vision of justice reimagined. Jason?
Thank you so much. So, as some of you guys know, lately, I have many research projects going on at the moment, but one of them right now has been some of my critical ethnographic work in Baltimore and Ferguson. So tonight, I want to share with you guys some of the pictures I have taken while at both of these sites, because we have about 6 minutes. So I want to share some of the pictures, talk about some of those pictures, give you some context to those pictures, and then some of the takeaways, if you will. So I want to first start with some snapshots from Baltimore. So this is a picture on the side of the project housing complex that Freddie Gray lived in. And Freddie Gray, if you recall, was one of the victims of state violence in Baltimore, okay? And if you focus in on this particular picture, what struck out to me upon taking this picture was that they included, for example, Maya Hall on this picture, right? A female's name here. Because one of the main critiques, if you will, of the Black Lives Matter movement was that it wasn't inclusive to females, right? And Kimberly Crenshaw came out with the hashtag Say Her Name, right, as a result of that. And this was something that we read about last semester in my Black Lives Matter class in particular, the need to foreground Black women in our examinations of this phenomenon. And this is another mural a couple of blocks down from Freddie Gray's housing project, where they begin to foreground some of those issues. So for example, the fact that even in Baltimore, you have these women's groups who are going around and sort of organizing around these anti-police brutality efforts. And so this mural right here, again, depicts some of the actions that they have been partaking in Baltimore. Now, again, going back to Freddie Gray's housing project, this was another picture that really struck me when I decided to take the picture, because again, here you have two African-American youth, one individual wearing a fitted and a hoodie, the other with his hand up, and then with the handcuffs on his wrists, sort of, I guess, showing his conquest for freedom, and then the flag upside down, right? Sort of in solidarity with the Colin Kaepernick thesis, right? Sort of making a statement that, well, you know, this is America, but America hasn't, you know, it's not for us, right? Utter resistance here. And then this is another picture on one of the other buildings in Freddie Gray's housing project complex. And this is a picture of Freddie Gray. And then to the left here is a picture of Martin Luther King and his colleagues back in the 60s. And then to the right are the millennials, so the new age civil rights activists marching. And then this is another picture. This is on his actual building. So this is the building that he actually lived in. And when I spoke to some of the people in the community about this, there were mixed messages. So some people believe that, this is a positive thing. It's okay to sort of commemorate him. But then there were others who, had very strong feelings about this. So some felt that, well, this was a constant reminder as to the futility of Black life. They felt that for the children in particular, it didn't do them any good. Right, because it reminded them that Freddie Gray could have been them, and that, quite frankly, it could still be them. Right, and so they pointed to some of the psychological damages of having to walk past this day in, day out. Because while the materials that you see here on the ground may go away, the paint may not. Right, that will remain. And then while down there, because again, this was a critical ethnographic project, I also wanted to take pictures of other aspects of the community. And if you look deeply into this picture, into the midsection in particular, you see that there are people who are actually living, right, in this abandoned building. And you can walk for blocks and see this forever in Baltimore, right? And yet we expect these individuals to sort of grow up and live mainstream productive lives, go to school, abstain from crime, and so forth and so on. Right? And yet here you see that somebody's actually living in that. And of course, I don't think anybody in here would want to switch places, right, with the family that has to live in those conditions. But yet, this is a mainstay for individuals who live in that community. And then this is just another snapshot of other buildings and other blocks that, again, you can walk for blocks and see this. Now, moving into Ferguson, these are pictures from my visit down to Ferguson in after the 1 year anniversary. And by then, many of the businesses on West Florissant, which is the main site at which you had a lot of the tensions between the clashes between police and protesters, many of the businesses began boarding up their windows and their doors and so forth. But what a lot of people don't know is that there were some businesses down there on West Florissant that were actually friendly to the movement, friendly to protesters. So if you look deeply into this picture in particular, you see, for example, over here, it reads that we stand with you, right? We stand with you. And I think this was like a beauty shop. But this was really interesting for me this was like my third trip back down here. Really interesting to see, because if you look at some of the media depictions of what was uncovering down there in Ferguson, you would think that all of the shops were sort of protester and so forth. But yet, again, the shops that were pretty sympathetic to the movement had allowed for a lot of the demonstrators to actually paint and create artwork. And this was one of the businesses that was unfortunately burned down as a result of the immediate aftermath of Mike Brown's death. So there was a lot to capture on West Florissant. This is his community. This is one of his memorials here, which extended into the street. And this is a site of extreme contested space, because if you recall some of the allegations of the police department coming and taking some of the teddy bears off the street. There were allegations of some of the materials being burned and so forth. But a lot happened here. And I'm showing these pictures because I'm hoping that I'm getting at some of your emotions. Hopefully I'm placing you at the scene. You're feeling some things as a result of these pictures. This was the memorial of Vanderet Myers, another African-American young man who was also the victim of police violence down in the St. Louis area. This also happened during the same time that Mike Brown was killed. But I think Mike Brown's case sort of overshadowed Vanderet Myers. But what's interesting about this particular site is that after 10 minutes of being there, his parents showed up. And so I had a conversation with his mom and his father. But what really stuck with me with regard to my conversation with the mother is that she was, her heart, I would say, she was heartbroken at how the news media, the local news media, kept painting her out as this sort of failed Black mother, right? And if you think intersectionally, and again, going back to my earlier picture about how Baltimore tried to include the perspectives of Black women, it forced me to think about the ways in which the media fails to fully capture the effect that these shootings have on these Black parents in particular, right? And in particular, in this case, on the mother. Because by all accounts, when I spoke to the uncle and other people in the community, they said that this mother did all that she can to raise this man the right way, right? She was actually a really good mother, and yet you would not get that from the media depictions. And so from speaking with her, she was most heartbroken by those media depictions. This was a picture, and again, this is 1 year after his death. If you recall, many of the tensions re-ensued that night. Many clashes happened on this night, and this is the protest car that many people drove around Ferguson. They've written on it, hands up, don't shoot, so forth and so on. This is on West Florissant. Many of the businesses I shown earlier are on this block. There's the infamous McDonald's. I sat in there and had done many interviews at that McDonald's. This was also the McDonald's where members of the press were illegally arrested by the Ferguson Police Department. And it's also important, too, to state how organized these demonstrations were in Ferguson. Because if you look at this picture, the individuals with the green hats were legal observers. So their jobs were to watch very carefully the interactions between law enforcement and the demonstrators. But in addition to them, we also had the medics, right? And so this is a picture of myself. Probably needed a retwist too, right? But hey, it was the summer, who cares? But this is a picture of myself. And there was a moment at that night where the police started throwing it to gases or whatever have you. And the medic said, listen, you guys need masks, put these on, and so forth and so on. I remember this night very clearly because it felt like I had performed about 50 suicides. I mean, the constant running up and down the street, running away from the threats and so forth and so on. But moving into some of the participant results to wrap up, from both of these sites, because again, I engaged in critical ethnographic research at both sites, not only go into some of the demonstrations and some of the meetings within the communities and talking to individuals, but also, like I said, sitting down with some of the families affected by police violence and so forth. But the vast majority of them felt that police did not serve their communities in a positive light. They believed that racism played a large role in the ways in which the police interacted with their respective communities. They believed that poverty was the impetus for many of the ills in their community, and that over-criminalization and over-policing actually complicates their lives, thus limiting their freedom. Many believed that their lives did not matter to the broader public, so everyone on the outside world, so to speak, they're not listening to their outcries. And that essentially American democracy does not include them. It has never included them, some felt. I felt this strong sense of abandonment. Many believe that there are two systems of justice, one for whites, one for people of color. And what's interesting to note here is that much of what they had to say is later corroborated by the DOJ reports that came in the aftermath, right, of the riots and the protesting and so forth. So for me, reimagining justice would come with a renewed criminal legal system that truly values the ideals of due process, fairness, equality, that protects the sanctity of life at all costs, which is a debate actually that they're having in California at this time. And one that listens and remembers that it is accountable to all of its citizens and not just a select few. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Our second speaker is Dr. Jessica Henry. She was the 2014 University Distinguished Teacher. She has been an associate professor. She's been a former chair of justice studies. Her research expands from wrongful convictions to hate crimes to death penalty perspectives. Her work has been widely translated into a variety of languages and was even adopted by the government of China as a policy piece when they were examining the death penalty and its applications in China. It is my distinguished pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Jessica Henry, who really needs no introduction, since most of you have probably been in one of her classes at one juncture or another.
Hi, everybody.
Okay.
So I'm going to be talking about imagining justice in the context of wrongful convictions. So in the context of people who are wrongly convicted of crimes that they simply didn't commit. And to start the conversation, if I can use this clicky, everyone who's had me knows I love a clicky, but this is not mine. Oh, just you press it. So the first thing I want to start by saying is, in the criminal justice system, before somebody can be convicted, the prosecutor has to prove the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean beyond all doubt. It doesn't mean to an absolute certainty. It doesn't mean to 100% accuracy. We allow for the possibility of error in the very standard by which we require the prosecution to prove its case. So the possibility of error is built in to the criminal justice system. We create that opportunity every time we bring someone before a jury or into a courtroom and require the prosecution to meet its burden of proof, which means we sometimes get it wrong. And when we do, people are sent to prison for crimes that they didn't commit, where they can languish not just for days, but for months and years, and sometimes decades. Most recently, just in the last month, someone was released from prison having been wrongly convicted for a crime where he served 45 years. So there's a couple things we need to sort of accept as truths. First is that innocent people are wrongly convicted of crimes they didn't commit. And we know for sure of 2,197 known exonerations. That was as of yesterday. Today, that number is actually 1,098. That's only the tip of the innocence iceberg. We actually don't know how many people are wrongly convicted. But we do know that about 2.3 million people are in the criminal justice system. Estimates range between 3 and 5% of those people are wrongly convicted. I'll let you do the math, but it's thousands of people potentially who have been convicted of crimes that they did not commit. The second thing that we need to accept as a truth is that even though it's beyond a reasonable doubt and not beyond all doubt, right? Even though we kind of build into the system this possibility of error, when innocent people seek to challenge their conviction, the system does absolutely everything in its power to protect and preserve their conviction. And I'll give you a couple of examples so you know I'm not just saying that. The first I want to talk to you about is Wilton Dedge. He was convicted of rape in Florida, was sentenced to 22 years, and he was one of the first people who had heard about DNA and requested that his DNA be tested. So he made this request in 1996. Now, there was a bill that was pending in Florida that didn't get passed till 2001, but somehow his motion in 2000 got granted. And they tested that DNA, and it excluded him. He was not the rapist. But instead of cooperating, the prosecution said he filed his motion too soon, the new law doesn't apply to him, and we will not work with you to exonerate him. It took 3 years and many, many appeals before a court finally agreed to retest the evidence where he was excluded again. So not only did this man serve a total of 22 years for a crime he didn't commit, but he was held 3 years longer than he ever needed to be held because the prosecution fought him. Anthony Wright. He was exonerated in 2016 after having been sentenced to life in prison without parole for a terrible crime, a rape and murder of a 77-year-old woman in Philadelphia. And he had been coerced into confessing. I know many of you do not understand that, but false confessions are very, very common in the context of wrongful convictions. But he too had DNA that could be tested, and the prosecutor's office fought him for 8 years before they would release the evidence to allow for DNA testing. And as soon as it was released, it confirmed that someone else, a man named, Ronnie Bird, had committed the crime. So Ronnie Bird had passed away in the interim, and instead of releasing Anthony Wright, our person who we're talking about here, the prosecution came up with a whole new theory, one they hadn't presented at trial originally, saying Anthony Wright worked with Ronnie Bird to commit this murder. Ultimately, Anthony Wright was acquitted and he was released, but the prosecution wouldn't let it go. I'll give you a third case, and this is a movie you can watch called The Confessions. Has anyone seen it? It's about the Norfolk Four men who were coerced into confessing to a terrible rape murder. None of them committed it. There was DNA available before trial. They tested the DNA. They found the perpetrator. They matched the perpetrator. The perpetrator said, yeah, you know what? I confess. I did it, and I did it alone. But the prosecution said, no, you didn't, and changed the entire theory of the case and prosecuted each and every one of these men. And they all spent time in prison for almost 2 decades, even though the prosecutor knew that they had the right guy, which was none of these men. They were pardoned in March 2017. Now, some of you may be sitting there thinking, why? Why? Why would anybody do this? And it's not really clear, but I have some ideas, and this is taking us into sort of this talk about reimagining justice. Part of what happens is really good people go into the criminal justice system. If you want to be a prosecutor or you want to be a police officer, it's typically because you want to help the world, right? You want to help society. But there winds up being a culture in some offices or in some communities where winning becomes valued over justice. Regaining a conviction is the currency, not doing what's right. There's also a larger criminal justice issue where we have a commitment to finality over a fear of process. We're afraid that if we start entertaining these wrongful conviction cases, that we're going to open the floodgates. Some people call this the fear of too much justice. But that is a fear that we need to reckon with if we're ever going to really address the issue of wrongful convictions. We have election pressures. We have elected judges and elected prosecutors who are afraid to be seen as soft on crime, particularly in high-profile cases. And there's lots of psychological theories. Are there any psychology majors or minors in here? So I can't get into all of this. I'm so glad to see you all here. But there's this notion of cognitive dissonance, right? And part of that, and it's much more complicated than what I'm about to say, but is this notion of if you're so committed to a theory and you feel like you've done right, then how do you face the unfaceable, knowing that you actually did something wrong or that you got it wrong? And so when I think about how we could reimagine things, it's actually addressing that attitude. Can we imagine a system that would allow us to take these claims seriously? And part of it is attitudinal. So for the actors in the system, for the police and the prosecutors and the judges, they'd really have to embrace the reality that the system makes errors. We're all human, humans make errors, and not take it so that it's a case of them being condemned for having made this error, but kind of owning it and working to correct the error. That's an attitudinal shift. The second is procedural changes. We need to work on addressing procedures that could prevent wrongful convictions in the context of interrogation or eyewitness testimony or the reliance on informants or cross-checking people with real motives to lie. And we need to work on procedures that would better respond to both post-conviction claims of innocence. And that's how I would start to reimagine a justice system that really effectively responded to wrongful convictions. Thank you.
Moving this program along, our third speaker is Dr. Arnaud Kersey. Dr. Arnaud Kersey came onto the faculty about 4 years ago. He is part of the International Justice concentration. And one of the reasons why we recruited him and are very fortunate to have him is because Dr. Kersey does a great deal of sort of cutting-edge research on the field of transitional justice, which you may think of the word transition, which means movement, right, or provisional. And it's sort of a new emerging area in the law, given the kind of seismic changes that are occurring throughout the world as a result of student activism, political radicalism, and sort of a general overthrow, a general overthrow on the establishment vis-a-vis the idea that there are other methodologies by which a country can be governed. Without saying anything further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Kersey.
Thank you for this lovely introduction, Norma. Good evening, everybody. And in line with what has been said already, I will look at those that are marginalized, and I will make sure to sort of give those who are sidelined in sort of a process of bringing about or rendering justice, and then sort of give a couple of hints on how we can actually do this. And my reimagined justice is based on transitional justice, as Norma said, and more so 2.0, right? From a computer language, we update our HTML browsers, and so the youth and the activists that have, and that Jason mentioned at the domestic level, I'll shift that to the international level, and the technology and social media and imagination that they've used in order to create a voice are very, very inspiring and powerful. And to contextualize this, I will show you what's out there, because as Norma said, we live in a world where unfortunately conflict and injustice, be it social or through political violence, is sort of a daily presence in many, many countries. We can just look at Syria with the latest chemical weapons attacks by their leader, and our sort of quite awkward response by our own government here. And when we think about this, the idea of bringing about justice when gross human rights violations or mass atrocities have occurred, in the 20th century, we have sort of this notion of transitional justice that occurred. And you've probably heard in some of your classes where you treated genocide or the Holocaust about the Nuremberg Trials, right after World War II, where the international community, especially pushing with the US as a vanguard, to bring about accountability, to really render justice about one of the most heinous crimes that the Nazi regime has sort of committed against Jews and other individuals and groups of people that were not in sync with the regime, right? And so this was sort of one set of practices that eventually, over the course of several decades, developed into a veritable toolbox of measures that could help regimes and governments and political institutions in transition help to create a legacy of their past and deal with the past wrongdoings. And up here, I just have a short sort of official definition. You'll find that at the UN or at the International Center for Transitional Justice, an NGO who's based here in New York that works with these issues. And they define it as sort of measures that could be judicial, but also non-judicial, and that really help countries to sort of redress these injustices that occurred. And the measures include, for instance, truth commissions, war crimes trials, or reparations programs, right? And the problem, however, and this is where we get to the gist of my talk today, is that despite this idea of transitional justice, there's politics involved. And when we think about accountability and we think about a trial, Jessica mentioned wrongful convictions. I mean, similar things are at work when the international community or a country is trying to overcome a heinous past or a very dark chapter of their history that they don't really want to deal with. And I don't know how many of you have studied Latin America or African conflicts, but needless to say, when sort of the era of the Cold War ended, and so that the 90s, already mid-80s, so the 90s, brought about political change in Latin America, and the dictatorships that were supported by the CIA and by our own government had to sort of face this watershed moment. We are in a transition now. People and our societies are demanding change and are trying to account for this. Well, the elites weren't ready. They were not ready to say like, okay, I'm stepping down, put some handcuffs on, and I'm gonna sit in jail for the rest of my life. No, they created bargaining chips. And you can see up here, right, the triangle of these three circles: accountability, reconciliation, and amnesties. And oftentimes, the political elites would bargain and say, we want amnesties. We are immune against any court or prosecutorial advances that might be made in that transition process, right? And so, if you will, in many countries and in many transitions, the political elites were able to buttress their power and use the structures, the power or domination and repression that they used against society. They were able to prolong that even further, despite efforts of opponents or new voices of the transition government to make that change. And you probably followed the latest events because you might have been in college already with regards to the Arab Spring. When that was unfolding, it started in 2011, but dragged out for several years. And while there was a lot of euphoria in the air across the Arab world, except Tunisia, most of them fell back. Egypt as a classic example where the military regime took over again, right? And it's during this change where everyone was on the streets, and I think Jason mentioned that with regards to Ferguson, when you feel injustice has been done and you rally and you bring out an enormous force, an enormous powerful group of supporters that bring about change. The gun laws and the recent mass killings, the mass shootings are a great example, domestically speaking. But this was a moment where youth had sort of a say, at least in the streets. And unfortunately, in the aftermath of these protests, many of which were really repressed violently in many of these countries in the Arab Spring and the post-Arab Spring, has led to sort of a lukewarm and a more skeptical approach of what is actually happening and what we are able to do within change and raising a voice in society. And nonetheless, I think the power of sort of art and the creation of a collective memory, of a narrative that we can all believe in and that brings in different truths that were not dictated by the government are really, really important. And by art, I don't mean sort of the French Beaux-Arts when it comes to like paintings in a museum. By art, I mean forms of expression that are sort of seized by those who are marginalized, the underdogs. And oftentimes when we look at less affluent districts or neighborhoods, it is in form of graffiti. And graffiti can be, and is oftentimes by sort of official discourses, stigmatized as, oh, this is vandalism, this is destruction of public property. But I think when we look into, and you here see in sort of the shades of gray here, bits and pieces of a mural that was painted by artists in near Tahrir Square in Cairo during the uprisings here, you see that a roadblock, you see these squares here, was turned into a trompe-l'oeil, meaning a wall, a mural that pretends to be the continuation of the street. And so you see how powerful imagery can be here for sort of an average citizen that is confronted with sort of the security forces blocking off a street and cutting off an entire neighborhood. And we've seen this in Palestine, in areas where sort of the Israeli forces and the local Palestinian communities are very striving for that recognition. But again, these are two of the most prominent examples where this was put into place. And the idea of creating a voice through means that are easily accessible and that, thanks to technology such as social media, have become a powerful messenger to say, no, we're not listening to the regime anymore. And the regime oftentimes, as we've seen in Egypt, responds with even more repression and an apparatus of a police state that controls and surveils anyone that's opposed to the regime. But in these sort of very dire and desperate times, the communities create a form of resilience that stands up, and within their own sort of groups, they create on Facebook, on Instagram, and within their neighborhoods, they create their own reality that stands up to the injustice. And I think we need to sort of make sure that this bottom-up approach and the voices that we hear from the victims that have been ignored during transition processes are being heard. And I think a great example of where it took several decades to do this is the LGBT community with regards to the Holocaust. They had never, ever had a memorial, and it took them till the mid-2000s before they got their own memorial in Berlin, right next to the Jewish Holocaust Memorial. And it is something where advocacy and sort of social activism is really, really important, and it is sort of a track that needs to be supported. On that note, I'll hand over the floor to Norma again. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnaud. Our last speaker is Dr. Elenice de Sousa Oliveira. And Dr. Elenice de Sousa Oliveira joined us about 2 years ago. She has done her PhD work here, but she is a native of Brazil and has done all of her research on crime policing in the country of Brazil, in her own country of Brazil. She brings a different perspective of reimagining justice, and she's looking at how her research informs her conclusions about how she would reimagine justice. So without anything further, as she's taking a gulp of water, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. de Sousa Oliveira, okay?
Okay, thank you very much for all of you. And so I'm going to talk about my point of view of how we can reimagine justice. And I think, yes, we can reimagine justice. We can reimagine a world where our fundamental rights of equality, of fairness, of justice are a reality for all of us. But in order to create and in order to implement our vision of this world, we need to define injustice and measure it. One of the best ways that we can do this is through empirical research. As scholars and researchers, we have the responsibility to explore and examine all different sources of data, of evidence and information that help us to go beyond theories, beliefs, ideologies, and opinions about what injustice is. One of the best research methods that I can recommend, and I can personally have used, it's using the field research or the ethnographic research. This methodology, this methodology allows us to observe in a direct, in a very systematic way, who the victims of injustice are. Listen to their voices, know their life conditions, understand injustice from their personal perspective and experience, and understand how they have responded to injustice in order to survive. Ethnographic research as a tool, it's very powerful because it increases our awareness of injustice and help us to provide recommendations to improve this. So policymakers, legislators, the police, and we as citizens can do something about it. New laws can be enacted, new policies implemented, police can restore legitimacy, and resources can be distributed in a more effective and a more fair way. So the images you can see projected here illustrate the ethnographic work that I personally conducted while studying violence in a favela or shantytown in Brazil some years ago. The video itself, it's a very good example of a different type of instrument that you can use to collect information. Being there and being able to observe the physical environment of the favela, the social dynamics and the social conditions of this community, helping me to understand how the marginalization of this community and the lack of resources created the perfect environment for violence to flourish. I also participated in ride-alongs with the police and conducted interviews with gang members. From their perspective, I was able also to understand how the lack of justice and resources led to the increase in violence. So here is my message for you. We, as researchers, need to be there in order to understand injustice and reimagine justice. It is then, and only then, that we will be able to recommend the policies necessary for change. That's it. Thank you.
I just have to say that I think you all are really lucky to have such an incredible, amazing faculty. I think you should give them a big round of applause right now.
Okay, so you showed us the images about remembrance a year later, but then you also talked about people's pushback to remember the traumas and stuff like that. So how do you think that plays into our ability to reimagine justice and really change things when we are afraid to confront our past and confront like the really traumatic things that happen to us?
So, I don't know. It's a deep question, right? Because on the one hand, we got to confront these traumas, but on the other hand, we're still dealing with the fact that many of us are knee deep in some of these traumas. Deep question. Not even sure really how to answer it, right?
Well, can I take a stab?
Yeah, go ahead, take a stab.
Okay. Let me just sort of interject here. For many of you may not know, I'm Spanish, okay, from Spain. And probably the seminal sort of traumatic event in our history is the Spanish Civil War, where literally half of the population wiped itself out, and we had a dictatorship for about 40-something years. A lot of atrocities were committed by both the left and the right throughout the course of the war and afterwards. I grew up where there was no freedom of press, where more than 3 people assembled could be arrested because you were a mob. Listen to the word, mob, okay? And you could be incarcerated for no reason except you didn't quite look right or you didn't quite look right at the policeman. Spain went from a dictatorship to a democracy. But just like I'm seeing and observing now with Ferguson and with the Baltimore incidents, there was a subtext of the question you have precisely posed. What makes us either be able to heal, get past it, or come as one? And the country struggled. And I'm going to tell you the incident at what worked for Spain, which had not worked for about 20 years, is a lot of people were shot in a civil war. Basically, if you're on the wrong party, they literally take you outside of the town, line you up against the cemetery, shoot you, and put you in a common grave. You're not marked. Your family just knows you disappeared, and poof, you're gone. You figure you're dead. All of the bodies that were interred in these kind of common graves, and there were many, it was 3 years of a civil war, so you can only imagine, were disinterred, and through DNA and scientific evidence, the remains were identified. At this point, we're talking bones, right? Because it's about 40-year difference here. We're talking, I'm going to say 2002, right? Civil War ends in 1939. That started to give closure because people were doing something as common as burying their beloved ones who had sort of disappeared. And what I'm saying is the time and a sort of a seminal event of acknowledgement sort of began to make the pieces work. The United States is nowhere close, given all of the racial sort of undertones and overtones and every kind of tone you want to talk about, to reach that point. I think there will be steps, but it's a very long and arduous process, okay? Remember, 40 years.
And,
we're all of the same race and ethnographic background, right?
one of the things that we've discussed, but maybe other people aren't as familiar with, is there's a project down in Alabama where they are gathering all the remains of people who were lynched in the Reconstruction era. Over 4,000 people have been documented as having been lynched, and there's, for the first time, a museum that's been opened in honor of all the lynching victims, and there's a memorial. And it's the first time our country's been forced to reckon with this history that most of us don't even know happened. So that's part of it, is sort of the acknowledgement, taking a moment to say, we did this, and we need to look at it and go through it before we can come out the other side.
Okay.
And
Someone
the
over
last,
there. Okay, go ahead.
one last thing that I wanted to add here is also we need to look at these processes as something dynamic. Oftentimes when a government, for instance, decides we're going to have a truth commission to deal with this, for them it's something, I will put this in the drawer, it's done with, we don't have to deal with it anymore. But when I mentioned the LGBT community and the Holocaust, for instance, at the very end of my talk, I mean, this is a classic example of how advocacy has sort of shifted and changed, and in the end, they won. They got what they wanted, but that doesn't stop necessarily the process overall from revisiting and looking at the Holocaust. And the first generation victims was a completely different category of victims than the second generation of victims, right? And so I think with Spain, we had that too. It was the grandchildren that actually helped move the process along with regards to digging out the bones. And so you see there is a dialogue that needs to be established. And I think that's still lacking in the US.
Okay. Someone over there had their hand up before. Gentleman in the back.
Hi. I want to be a prosecutor in the future, and I've always posed that question that you asked, if that, with the wrongful convictions, prosecutors are very prideful in their nature in the sense of with their winnings, and they base their reputation on their winnings. So I guess my question for you is, do you think it's possible to shed that skin and shed that aggressiveness and kind of readjust, I guess I want to say because I do plan to be prosecuted, and rebuild ourselves based on our morality and not on the horse that we're given to ride on? Because I don't know if we have any choice in the sense of how we prosecute and the choices that we make. So do you think that with the future generation and the people who are being, like, all these situations are being thrown in our face and we have to question the morality and the decisions that we make, do you really think that it's possible to change the way prosecutors prosecute?
Sure, I always believe in change. Change is possible. Yeah, I do think it would require a shift in attitude. If we could, there's lots of language about what it means to be a prosecutor, and their duty is to do justice. That's what they're hired to do. That's what they're told they're hired to do. That's what you're taught in law school. So it would really have to be a reconceptualization of what it means to do justice and to move away from defining justice as getting that conviction. Is that possible? Sure. And we are seeing, just so that you know, conviction integrity units in some prosecutors' offices that are actually working to reinvestigate cases. There's not a lot of them, and some of them are just for show, but there are a few, particularly the one in Brooklyn, for instance, that's been doing a really good job at looking at some of these cases and working collaboratively when there is persuasive evidence of innocence. So it's possible. We just have to sort of continue to work towards attitudinal change.
Anyone else? Yes, sir. Yep. Coming your way, coming your way. Go ahead, Jack.
So this is a question for Dr. Williams. Listening to your presentation and seeing specifically the one where they had the outline of the person with the name, I actually recently seen something like that in my community at home. So I was going to ask, how do you feel personally like the community playing a role in these types of situations benefits, like, I guess you could say, the movement? Because I know that what happened with what I saw was that there was a big drunk drive, it was like right near a bar, and some toddler got hit by a car because somebody was drunk driving, and the child ended up losing their life. So now, like, every time like the rain or like the snow gets rid of the marking on the in the street, they actually redraw it and like put a blood pool around it. And like they have like that whole stuff, animal memorial. So doing stuff like that, do you feel like it really benefits the
Well, so again, like I mentioned with the Mike Brown Memorial, there were allegations that the police were coming through and like snatching the teddy bears off of the street, the allegations of them burning the memorial down and so forth and so on, but they kept sort of rebuilding it back. So there's a sense of community empowerment, okay, on behalf of the community by having those memorials there and maintaining them. But also in remembering who the person was, because these are individuals who were, again, part of these communities, right? They had personality. They had a connection to these communities. They meant something to the people in those communities. And so there's these strong connections to wanting, again, to keep these memorials alive. So, yeah.
Okay.
I hope that
I think maybe to add one last thing, because it ties in nicely with the international level, because I think it is also an empowerment as against sort of media or sort of the voice that is left out. And in Egypt, Tunisia, and the broader sort of MENA region, youth and activists were able to create their communities locally. So they would also recreate their murals, and then they'd be whitewashed by the police or security forces. And then they'd, instead of getting frustrated and recreating the same memorial, which is often the time, depending on what happened, if it was one event, but if you had an array of events, the artists and the advocacy or activists use that as an opportunity to have a fresh canvas to tell a new story, because 5 other people had been killed by security forces in the last couple of days, right? And I think it's that empowerment that shifts the voice.
Okay. Jack, over here, this gentleman. You had your hand up. Oh, are we going? We're going over here. Gentleman, and then over here and over here.
Hello? Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you guys for being here. I'm humbled. This is an amazing array of talent in the room, so I appreciate you all taking your time to be here. I suppose my question's for the panel, but probably in the wheelhouse of Dr. Williams. I'm the director of community policing, and I run a Coffee with a Cop program. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I found some pretty good success with that, not just from reaching out to the community, but also softening some of the opinions of the officers, because I think a lot of my colleagues maybe have this us versus them mentality because they feel sort of attacked by the media. What do you think the best way is that I can either convince my colleagues or that we can ensure we build allies as we continue to make progress on that front?
I think the conversations need to continue to happen. You know, that was something that I picked up at both of these locations. That so you had the community policing literature in many instances is problematic, right? I mean, you have some positives and you have some negatives, but matriculating through these communities, some of them felt that that the conversations between the police department and the community could be strengthened, because what you find is that they don't know each other. They don't know each other, and what we talk about in my community, my policing class, is that sometimes we forget that the police, they work for the community, right? And that you should be talking to the community, that you should be responding to the demands of the community. Right? So it shouldn't be this us versus them mentality to begin with, because you work for the community, right? And so I think that if you increase these conversations with the community, get to know what their demands are, what they expect from you, and so forth, then I think a lot of those tensions would decrease. Because I think we seem to have forgotten that, right? That police officers are community servants. I think that's what we have forgotten, and that's the problem. And that's why in my Reimagined Justice, in my closing, I said that if we could reestablish a criminal legal system that understands that, right, that you have to be accountable to everyone, right, all citizens, all taxpayers, then we would have a much, much, much better system. So I think that program that you guys are doing, I didn't know about that. Maybe we need to talk about that. But I think that program is excellent, excellent. I would continue doing that. And just reminding your colleagues that this is what you're supposed to be doing. Serving the students, the Montclair State Police. Local, okay, cool, yeah, serving the community.
I'd like only to add something to reinforce what Professor Williams said. I'm from Brazil, and I have participated in many community policing programs, and in favelas, in shanty towns, where we have a lot of violence. And I think this is the formula. As he said, the police is the community, and the community is the police. It's the public is the police. So we needed to reinforce the communication and the dialogue between the police and the community. And as I said at the end of my presentation, we needed to be there. As researchers, as the police, as policymakers, we needed to see, to understand injustice, from their point of view of the community. If the police don't understand, it's going to be impossible to rebuild the community.
And that's where these feelings
to create legitimacy, that it's the most important thing.
That's what I was going to touch on.
Yes. Hold on a second. Another question here. I'm now moving this way across this young lady. Okay.
This is a question for Dr. Henry. So what happens to the people that are wrongly convicted of a crime that they didn't commit? Like, what does the government, what justice is the government going to serve for them?
So it's a great question. It depends on the state. So some states have compensation laws that give you X amount of dollars per year that you spent in prison. But I'll tell you, it's not that you get out of prison and they give you $100 or whatever it is, or $1 million or whatever it might be. You actually have to apply in most states, and it can be quite onerous. So you get out penniless, and you have to wait until you are compensated, and you often have to find a lawyer who will do it for you, who will then take a cut sometimes of what you get. There are lots of states that don't have compensation laws at all. And some compensation is really, you'd be shocked, like $25,000 capped, even if you've spent 20 years, maximum $20,000. But some places like Texas do it really well. They give you $50,000 a year. They give you education and medical benefits and make it really easy for you to apply. And they actually do a really good job there. But lots of states don't. So it's quite tragic.
All right.
Will it be in their record that they...
So you would think you're wrongly convicted, you're exonerated, woohoo! Your record is expunged. And that is also often a separate process that you have to go through.
Yeah.
And also keep in mind this. Let's say you've spent 15 years in prison. Let's say you're exonerated. Let's say your record's expunged. You still have 15 years of nothing on your resume when you're applying for a job. You got to say you were somewhere doing something. So it's very tricky.
Okay. Ma'am, I think we have two questions back here.
Hello. So my question, I guess, is for anyone who wants to answer it, because I think the common theme
Pressure's
is...
on. Go ahead.
I'm sorry?
The pressure's on.
Yeah, it's the common theme is having that conversation. So I want to know what your opinion is, how to ask without offending, because, for example, with wrongful convictions, if you go to a prosecutor and say, listen, like, this is what happened. This is, like you messed up. Like, how do you get them to reconcile with that and not take it personally and say, no, I was right, because I think that's the common theme in our culture is to be so, like, no, I was right, don't come near, this is done, this is closed, we can't look at it again. Like, how do we start to open that conversation without offending individuals and to have that, like, open communicative, like, space?
I think if I won't talk about wrongful convictions, but I'll do that or shift to sort of transitional justice or political violence that is committed by the state, and then the state sort of turns a blind eye. And I think you have to look at it from different levels, and it's about coalition building or alliance building. And when we look, for instance, what's happening in Syria, and the whole world is looking away, and everyone's fleeing the place, and no one wants to do anything, there is still a handful of very courageous and brave people that say, we need to collect evidence, or we need to help the people to stop this injustice. And there is this Committee of International Justice and Accountability that is collecting evidence. Let's imagine Assad's troops go in and are trying to conquer a rebel place outside of Damascus. And so the rebels are fleeing. Even before anything happens, some activists at night or dusk and dawn go in and grab wherever files are available. And that is true when a rebel group conquers or attacks a town held by the regime. And then they smuggle the documents back to sort of a safe place. And it is a very tedious undertaking. And I mean, they risk their lives. And if you've seen what Assad has done to many, many journalists, when usually journalists, the press works, they're transparent. They say, like, we're occupying this hotel. And many times when a regime does not like the press or international press coverage they get, well, there's a little collateral damage and a bomb or a missile hits the place, right? And there's many journalists that died doing their job, and the governments are not being held responsible. And I think while the international community has a responsibility, we're in a deadlock with the UN and the 5 veto powers. But at the grassroots level, we can do a lot in order to move ahead, even though it's slow and it only happens incrementally.
I'm going to take it from a different perspective, excuse me, because I think one of the things that you're sort of addressing is how do we get past our cultural sort of background, right, in our identity. And culture is extremely important to each and every one of us because it's the one thing we hold on to in the face of any adversity. The culture of the criminal justice system in the United States is adversarial. That's the theoretical foundation of it, right? It's myself against Jessica if she's the prosecutor. Not that that would ever happen, but nevertheless. And so it's based around winning. So there's got to be a cultural shift. And a cultural shift is won by education and by retraining, certainly at the law school level, whereby it's sort of teaching doctors how to be more empathetic when dealing with a patient, right? If you ever see a doctor, he's like, on a clock, it's 3 minutes, you're terminal, goodbye, I'll see you in 3 months when you're dead. And you're sitting there going, oh my God, what do I say now? There's nothing to say. But most medical schools, seeing how doctors are not responding correctly to patients, have started to reorganize the thinking of what it is to be an effective doctor. And I think law schools, in order to get past the winning at all costs, have to sort of re-educate themselves that way. You know, knowing perfectly well that sometimes it's going to be a very, very long process to do so.
There's
it's
also
a 30-year.
There's also something happening right now which is really interesting. You know, when a plane crashes, there's a big investigation. They don't blame the pilot. It's not sort of, they don't go in and say, you're wrong, you're they kind of go in and they investigate. They say, okay, Mr. Pilot, what happened here, Miss Pilot? What happened here? Okay, controller worker, okay. And they kind of re-examine everything collaboratively to say what went wrong. In the context of the criminal justice system and wrongful convictions specifically, some folks have said, well, why can't we do the same thing? Why can't we just all sort of say, like, ooh, this guy got wrongly convicted. What happened? How can we make sure it doesn't happen again? So that's another way. That's a much more collaborative model, which isn't about blame. So we're not saying to the prosecutor, you are wrong. We're saying, something went wrong. A little bit here, a little bit there. This one influenced that. How can we not do that next time? Very different conversation. But we're not set up for that well right now.
And certainly if you approach it from that perspective, you're not going to get your hackles up, right? You're going to sort of sit and listen and examine critically versus it's not me. I'm not taking responsibility. No way, I was never wrong. So good question. All right, back there. Neil, lady in the back, all the way in the back.
You all had a very different view of how you thought justice should be reimagined. What do you all think the steps would be to turn this imagination into a reality?
Aside from waving a magic wand?
Yeah.
Okay, that would be one. I'll let my colleagues answer, but I'll just give my 2 cents as a sort of an outsider insider, because I came from a completely different kind of system. It's a process, it's time, it's keeping an open mind, it's fostering collaboration and acceptance. It's moving from the you're right, I'm wrong dyad to we're all kind of wrong some of the time and we're right some of the time. And that takes a very long process, even at a very micro level, right? Even in a small classroom level, where you sort of then figure out, oh, this was not what I wanted it to be, and sort of I hold part of the blame as an instructor because I wasn't clear enough. So I think from my perspective, it's looking at the process and starting in incremental stage. Look at the process of civil rights in this country, right? 1953, Selma, Alabama is very different than, well, we can have the debate. We can have the debate big time, to modern day. But there have been strides, there have been movements, but again, not as fast and not as well defined as it should be. But it's a process. So I would look at it from that perspective. I'll turn it over to anybody else.
Yeah, I would say that we still have a lot of conscious raising to do. You know, there are a lot of people who are still unaware of the suffering that's happening in this country. You know, when I put up the pictures in Baltimore, you know, I do a lot of talks throughout the year, and a lot of people are just unaware of it. You know, so I think that first we need to have a lot more conscious, you know, raising before we can then move to what those next sort of institutional steps are going to be. Because a lot of people are just simply not aware of it. And we're not taught it in our K through 12 systems. You know, going through elementary school, middle school, high school, and college, I learned everything there was to know about European American history. Never learned much about African American history, or Chicana and Chicano American history, or indigenous history, right? And so there's a lot that needs to be learned by all of us before we could even really get to that next step.
Okay. Anyone else?
Well,
Go ahead, Joe.
let's continue, right? If you don't have, do you have
so-
anything to say or not?
Well, I love what Elenisi said about just being there and being present. And I do think, you know, using the context of wrongful convictions for a second, that's kind of the canary in the coal mine, right? I mean, a lot of these folks were wrongly convicted, and when they're exonerated, it's an opportunity for us to say, like, hey, what's going on? Because even people who are correctly convicted in the sense that they're factually guilty often experience a lot of the processes that many of us would describe as unjust or unfair. So it's a real opportunity to kind of take a look at what is happening and how we can improve the system. I'm optimistic that as more and more narratives of innocence sort of continue to paper the landscape, that we will see incremental change. I think it's possible to do it better.
With regards to the international level and so the political violence that is happening left and right, I think we have to rethink not only criticizing the top-down structures, but also critically look at the bottom-up. And there's this notion of competitive victimhood. Take Bosnia, for instance. Roughly 100,000 people died, 100,000 too many. In the eyes of the Serbs, who committed most of the crimes, it's like a couple thousand. In the eyes of the Bosnians who lost their lives, it's like 500,000. No, we're closer to 1 million. I'm just like, and fudging the numbers doesn't help, right? And so with regards to the LGBT memorial that I mentioned earlier, I mean, it was mostly male gays that were persecuted during the Holocaust. Lesbians, not so much. They had a much easier time. Yet there was like an intricate fight between the lesbian community and the male gay community about the memorial. There was a video with two males kissing, and the lesbian said, "We want our memorial in there too," right? So it's this infighting within the community that is also very poisonous. And I think it is about access. It is about making sure that there's no black and white or dichotomous thinking, but that there is a dialogue and an open access for all the victims. And that's why that dynamic process, no matter whether it's 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, if someone feels their voice needs to be heard, that space is being opened up. Thanks.
Yes, I'm thinking here. I believe that we need to create more leaders. And I think we as the scholars and the university, we have an important role in creating new leaders because we are the ones who do the research. We are the ones who collect the data and try to understand the problem. But what we do, it's on publications, research papers that nobody reads, to tell the truth. Probably only few people in academia.
My students, since I forced
or
them.
maybe our students.
That's what.
So everything that in our publications, we are there conducting research and finding all those important things about justice, but nobody read. And we as researchers, we are not there in the communities. So I think we need to be there too. Like in Professor Jason Williams is a very good example. So we needed to be there. We needed to engage more with the communities. We needed to engage more with our students. We needed to educate and change our mentality, our mindset, and be open to a dialogue. Because if not, we're gonna keep our wounds. We're never gonna heal anything. And we need to heal. And how are we going to heal? We need leaders who are going to be able to listen, to sit, and to change and think in other options for us to create a new world. I think that's my message.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. Okay, somebody's going to get 10 points extra credit if you ask one of the other people. Okay, but no, go ahead, ask your question.
I just wanted to ask about,
he's tired of talking.
It starts at school, right? So like teaching the history, changing the history that we're teaching, and that will change the system. Well, what else, would you be able to change that? Like,
well, I think it kind of goes back to some of the comments that you, Michaela, read about the ethnographic and trying to sort of humanize other people and their experiences and so forth. So, for example, every so often we hear these reports, right, about like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and those, the typical states down there, trying to take slavery and what the colonizers did to the Native Americans out of the history books. What was the recent trope that the Native Americans invited the colonizers here and gave them space to settle down, which we know is a complete, total lie.
And that the Civil War was not about slavery.
Yeah, it wasn't about.
It was about states' rights.
Right.
Yeah. And that the Africans came here as workers, right? Which we know is just a complete, it's a lie. And so I think that if American history was more expansive in terms of how we're taught it, right, in the K through 12 system, then people will be a little bit more educated on the experiences and the histories and the cultures of other people. I think this is why we're in this mess that we're in now with immigration, for example, right? With Donald Trump, sort of criminalizing Mexicans, for example, in this notion of illegal immigration and so forth, or what have you. So yeah, and it's the same thing at the college level as well in the gen ed curriculums, right? So for example, where you have the option to choose these classes, but it isn't mandated, right? And it is also the case in some social science departments where you may have the option, but it isn't mandated. And so here you have time and time again, people being able to sort of skip around these classes to where they're actually college educated,
right? But maybe perhaps not so educated, right? I think the largest contingent of those who voted for Donald Trump were college-educated white males. So imagine if they were actually able to sit in classes where they were forced to learn about the cultural backgrounds and histories of other people, perhaps we wouldn't be in this mess. So I think it's important to learn about other people's cultures, their histories, and their backgrounds. And this is particularly the case in departments like ours. That's why we're like one of the best departments on this campus, because in our classes, these are the things that you get. Good question. She's one of my students too.
Okay, we know. Yes, ma'am.
So I have two questions. The first question is, you guys talked about like the justice side of like the international community, and you guys talked about how like the injustices towards like the government. And I'm an international student from Venezuela, so lately we've seen a lot of injustices being done by the government, and it's more like visible to the international community. I feel like in the past year it was more like camouflage, but now it's not so much. And you guys talked about like creating like awareness or speaking up through like art and stuff. And I feel like what I've seen in my country is that we do that a lot, but it's not working at all, and we're not getting any kind of support. And you guys talked about more like past things that have happened in the past with injustices. So I want to know what we can do with injustices that are happening right now, and how we can, I know it's not going to be a fast process, but how can maybe we can make it a little faster.
Yes, fast. Here we go. One of the great advantages you have in this generation is the absolute predominance of social media as a communication tool, where you can dispense from official forms of communication and you can post videos and communicate situations, which is exactly what happened during the Arab Spring, where obviously the Egyptian government shut down all forms of external communication, but it was people right there in Tahrir Square that were videoing, posting it, and we had a sort of bird's eye view of what in the world was going on. So I think going forward, and this is something that I was trying to think for my like closing remarks, is thinking of themes that have been brought up, is the prevalence and the importance of social media to influence and transform culture, right? So the fact that these pictures are disseminated, these images of the favela are sort of projected. Most of you, I mean, I've been to Brazil, but nevertheless, if I had not been to Brazil, I would have a very good idea, not a perfect idea, but a somewhat more educated idea of what some of the challenges were in an urban setting such as a favela, which I would not. And I would have a firsthand view of it. So for me, social media is a key component of reimagining justice, because it's a way of showing injustice in a very patent way. The same way that certain movies, because I'm the movie queen, right? So certain movies sort of resonate for me on what would be just, or what would be fair, or what would be good, right? And you walk away feeling good, or yeah, the hero won at the end. But I think now it's much more not qualified in that manner. I think social media is just there, and you, using your critical thinking tools, can look at it and derive some of an opinion based, of course, and I'll go back to what Dr. Williams said, based on being educated and knowing what the history is. Because I'm sorry, you cannot interpret the present without knowing what happened in the past. Because God only knows humanity keeps tripping over the same damn stone time and time again, right? And so you turn around and you go, gee, that happened in blah, 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 blah. I know for you guys, 1962, but nevertheless, you know, there's about 2,000, 3,000, or 4,000 millennials that we need to sort of deal with. But, you know, I think social media sort of brings it to the forefront, and you can look at it much closer than, for example, going to the library and opening up a magazine from another country and seeing what the picture said. Too many steps. You guys just sort of click and go, right? You click and go. That's a big advantage, okay? Anyone else want to tackle that? And also, there's also one thing. There's also always politics, If your country's not featured, there is a reason why. Okay, Rachel? Who's Rachel? Somebody's Rachel? Somebody up here in the middle, yes. Okay, go ahead. Right here, next to the lady who was blonde, right there. Don't worry, it's not Jillian.
Thank you.
Relax.
Well, my question, I kind of put together some of the comments that several of you made, and I was taking note of what several of you were saying. Dr. Williams, I know I'll just start with you, but you were showing us pictures of the memorials that people were making, and I was linking that to your comments about the art in the uprisings of the students and the young people who were violently put down after incidents like the Arab Spring, or movements like the Arab Spring and various other ones. And it was noteworthy to me because I was thinking about some other things that you guys, sorry, didn't discuss, like the Me Too movement and some other events that are happening, justice things that are happening in our culture lately. And I was thinking about how a lot of justice movements are related to the small things, the art movements, the upward movements instead of top down. So that comment was very notable to me. The people trying to put the memorials on the sidewalk or on the building, or putting stuffed animals in a site, and how important that is to keep that connection. So even the comment that you had made about community policing and what can be done. So the juxtaposition of the favelas and the level of violence, or the wrongful convictions and the level of gravity that holds, with the small things before, after a violent event or in a community, and how different those things are. And so I kind of was thinking about that brought my mind to our own campus, or campuses and schools, and what we learn, like other than history in a classroom. So there's some things we learn, the lack of how to have a discussion, the lack of how to change your culture is meaningful, because we don't learn how to do that very well. And there's this other piece of security being weaponized, protection being used against a community, not feeling like you have access to your own democracy or access in your own justice system. And to me, that's noteworthy. I worked with my own community policing unit in my own town for a long time, and that was something that we kept working on but couldn't quite grasp. And I came back to school and study in this department, and that's something that I keep trying to pay attention to, but keep noticing like just a lack of connection to. And I feel in general in school a lack of civil discourse, a lack of compared to when I was here earlier. And a lot of times, like, we used to go out and protest more. We used to go out and use our voices more. And now you have to give 48 hours notice for a permit for your own safety and the safety of other students. And I was just wondering, there's a lot of reason for that because of the time we live in, but there's a lot of effect that has on our democracy. I made a comment earlier today at the Board of Trustees meeting about higher ed institutions, especially public institutions of higher ed, being the gateway to the middle class, to building up access to our democracy and fueling our society's ability to keep a civil discourse up. And I'm going to let you comment, but I was wondering if any of that resonates to what you study and what any of you have had connections with in the places where you go in other areas, and what you think about. Last year I was studying sexual harassment, and it was, instead of waiting until it's absolute violence, it starts with small disrespect and small inability to communicate. And I was wondering if any of you had any comments in that area.
Yeah, I think with regards, thank you for your extensive comment. I think it resonates a lot with us. And when I travel and when I see how injustices occur at the small scale or at the big scale, right? And what Norma mentioned about the idea of social media being such a powerful, innovative tool of creating a space that wasn't there before, I want to sort of note or mention Michel Foucault's notion of heterotopia, which is sort of spaces of otherness, right? Think of a cemetery, right? It is a physical space, but yet it's also a space that's very transcendental, right? We create this in an effort to probably understand the afterlife, to communicate with our lost and loved ones, right? And every culture has a different burial ceremonial, right? And so these are things where currently when injustices, be it the Me Too movement or be it an artist group that is being persecuted in Tunisia, they had a great art festival in 2012 where women went out and they had amazing artwork that was, from our liberal Western perspective, not offensive. It was an expression of their feelings, of their world they live in, yet the patriarchal system, in particular the religious authorities, were really, really taken aside and were so shocked that they sent out the radicalists, the Salafists, and they ransacked the whole exhibit and the expo. And yet, they didn't stop. I have a close friend, Hella Amar. She's a professor of law and photography and artist, and she never stops. She just more recently posted an amazing photograph. I think it might have been a shared of a African black male with a sort of a headscarf, but covering the face, right? And then putting towards sort of the Facebook community these three stigma, right? You're black, you're gay, and then you live in a world that is so repressive and you can't express yourself. Yet other places you're able to do this. And I think by creating spaces where you can communicate, and again, it's a learning curve, right? It's not as like, oh, this is the perfect Facebook post and now everyone's happy, everyone understands it. We've seen it with the trolls, we've seen it with Mark Zuckerberg in the hearings in the last couple of days, right? He was sweating blood and then realized like, the senators don't get a thing. They have like the most basic questions, right? And so there is a disconnect, right? And I think, but the spaces are there, and if they're not there, we need to use our imagination to create them and then draw people in. The more people populate these spaces, then the more likely it is that we find sort of a dialogue and a way out, or a way to live together sustainably.
And then to sort of connect it back to like Ferguson and Baltimore, I think it goes back to my point and Elenisi's point, so to speak, of the importance of listening to people. Because if I take it back to Baltimore, for example, when they burned down the CVS, right? If you had turned on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and all of these other, everyone was speaking about how, this is just, how dare they? How, they're damaging public property, as if public property has more value over human life, right? How dare they burn down the CVS? Or even in Ferguson, they burned down the Quick Trip and the gas station and so forth and so on. But nobody stopped to think about the years before that, right? How these people were going to their city council meetings, right? Organizing around the issues that were plaguing their communities that created the riots to begin with, right? So the fact that they were forced to live in poverty, forced to live in communities with poor educational systems, right? Forced to live with these racialized programs of police brutality and so forth. And when you think about it in the context of really Ferguson and Baltimore, think about it. In the aftermath of Freddie Gray and Mike Brown, the Department of Justice had gone down there and had done reports, which pretty much 99.9% corroborates what these people were saying to begin with. So, I mean, an amazing comment, by the way. But I think, again, it goes back to the need to have to listen. You know, and when we again matriculate through our own little silos, right? Not really necessarily caring much about what's going on over here because it's not my community, then these are the things that happens, right? Ferguson happens, Baltimore happens, and so forth.
I think we should have one more question, and then Norma, you should give us your summarizing wisdom.
Wait, there's a lady waiting over here. Yes. Lady in green.
This is for Dr. Kersey and Dr. Williams, but everyone's free to answer. I'm a history major, double minoring in African American studies and criminal justice. And when I go for my doctorate, I want to do genocide studies. Something I struggle with that Dr. Kersey mentioned is accountability coinciding with justice. When you have big powers like systematic and sometimes oppressive powers, like the UN, the Big Five, veto powers, or policing power, how do they prevent progress in communities or in nations? Because like in accountability with justice or recognizing justice.
So yeah, the problem with the big powers that you have, I worked a lot on the case of the former Yugoslavia when it all fell apart. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was put in place. They passed the UN resolution in '93, and it was basically justice for peace. So they were hoping that they could stop the war. When did the genocide in Srebrenica happen? In '95. So it's really appalling to see that the international community was there, Dutch forces were there letting it happen, right? And so the problem here is that the politics of justice are very, very frustrating, no matter whether it's the International Criminal Court, whether it's an ad hoc court, an hybrid court. What I mentioned in my presentation earlier is that the elites in power and the elites that trying to cling on to the little power that's left is really problematic with those who lost everything, those who lost their families, those who had to flee the country. They're now in refugee camps. And refugee camps are meant something to be temporary, and all of a sudden you have a decade-long or several decade-long refugee camp because you can't go home. And so I think we're not there, and the international community is a hodgepodge of sort of coalitions that continuously are shifting, and it's sort of a power struggle with China now on the rise, and Russia all of a sudden having refound its old glory and trying to meddle left and right. And we were thinking in the 90s that we come to a broader agreement about how we can make this place a better world. But I don't think we should stop nonetheless. I think just to throw the towel and say, no, we can't change it, and it's going to be an anarchic system, and we're doomed. I think it's the efforts of individuals and then group social movements that really make that change, and that lobby and advocate in front of the UN, no matter how small they are, and getting at least that little voice in, and that changes that culture that Norma mentioned earlier, and a global culture, right? A transnational culture. Because if we were to say like, oh, they're abusing the human rights, so I should do the same. No, we should step up and say, we are changing this, right? And we serve as a role model. And then you have a trickle down or spillover effect that eventually will help. And the bottom up, the really civil society actors are crucial to make this happen.
Yeah, and you see a lot of these same politics in a domestic sense as well. But to sort of combat some of these, and you've had, for example, in the context of Black Lives Matters, and Ohio in particular, Columbus, Ohio, you've had these sort of debates with the new age millennial civil rights activists and some of the, I guess you can say like the old guard, right, in politics. And what you begin to see is, so for example, D. Ray McKesson, who rose to prominence in Ferguson, and I marched on some of the demonstrations with him down there. If you remember, he ran for, I believe, mayor of Baltimore. So you have a lot of these individuals actually beginning to, go into politics because they no longer sort of trust those who are currently embedded in these political institutions. So that may be another way forward in terms of trying to get some of the change that's necessary.
Okay. When you came in to listen to this presentation, my takeaway to you is this something you anticipated hearing from? Did you learn something from this? Do you have a takeaway of what you can do at your level versus what has been done at a national or international level? Because the idea of these kind of presentations is, of course, not perfect. So I'll address the question from one of you that said you're talking about things from the past and not necessarily looking forward. But everybody gets to pick what is most comfortable. If I asked you to pick something about justice, you would probably walk away with picking something that is within your core, within your background, that you have a comfort level. That is what we are attempting, and I think it comes through with all of these speakers, how personally invested they are in the things that they study, right? You feel it when they do the presentation, the sort of enthusiasm and conviction that this is one aspect of justice that they want you to walk away knowing. What I want you to walk away knowing is that you should educate yourselves each and every day and question each and everything that goes in front of you. And that's not so your head explodes, some like a mad scientist with too much data. No, what I'm asking is don't always take things for face value, okay? Understand the power of the media, understand the deficiencies of the media, and understand that just like we all made conscientious decisions to present justice from a particular prism that is our own, the media who is informing you is doing the same thing, right? So you have to sort of question, okay, so if they're reporting about Syria in this manner, or if they're reporting about Susan Cole at Montclair State in this manner, we'll make it local, okay? Why? What's the agenda behind it, okay? That's where you come in, and that's where you can invest yourself in making some sort of change. Understanding that you are just one in a series of individuals who will contribute to a particular perspective. All of the speakers today are individuals who are contributing to a field of study and education and outreach and information which we wanted to share with you today. We thank Neil for the opportunity. I thank you all for coming. Good luck with the extra credit, and see you soon. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Miss Ocello, repeating, Miss Ocello, please report to the deck area. There you go.